Hi, my name is Arkady Yerukhimovich, and today I want to tell you about the ransomware menace, what it is, why it is happening, and what we can do about it. So first, let me start by telling you what is ransomware. So a definition that I particularly like says that ransomware is a subset of malware that's designed to restrict access to a system or data until a requested ransom amount from the attacker is satisfied. And the key words in this definition are malware. So it's important to remember that ransomware is a type of malware, specifically malicious software. And the goal of ransomware, the way it works, is by restricting access either to a system or to some data. And the main purpose of ransomware, why it exists and what criminals try to do with it, is to actually, receive a ransom or to get payment to to give back this restricted access. So how does ransomware work? Well, in general, ransomware consists of the following four steps. The first step is the infection step, where the ransomware somehow gets onto the victim's system. This can be done by a phishing email and somebody running a malicious application, or by Trojan horse applications that have malicious behavior under a hood, under cover of some benign application, or the more standard kind of just vulnerabilities that are exploited by any other malware. After infecting the victim's system, the ransomware will usually communicate with some command and control center, for example, to exchange cryptographic keys, or really to sort of launch the attack. After which it enters destruction phase. In the destruction phase, this is where the ransomware either locks down your computer, or more commonly, encrypts all of your data in such a way that you cannot recover it. Once this is done, you no longer have access to your machine, at which point, the ransomware pops up a ransom note saying that, hey, you pay us some amount of money and we will then unlock your machine or decrypt your data. Um, and that's basically it. And so at the end of one of these attacks, you will see a screen like this. And this actually is a ransomware note from a recent ransomware attack, which basically says the following: your computer has been infected, your files have been encrypted, you have X amount of time to pay us some Y amount of money. In this case, they're asking for money in Bitcoin. And the hope is that if you pay, they will send you the decryptor to actually decrypt all of your data. So this is how ransomware works. Now I want to quickly go over a little bit about the history of ransomware. How did we get to where we are today? So ransomware is not a new concept. In fact, the first ransomware appeared in 1989. It was something called this AIDS Trojan. Uh, but this had a number of challenges, and a lot of these challenges stem from the fact that what I call is that this was still the pre-internet era. A lot of companies still weren't really connected to the internet. Email wasn't widely used, and so, in particular, is this infection step, distributing the actual ransomware was very difficult. In particular, this AIDS Trojan, did this by actually mailing, floppy disks to people and hoping that they would put them into their computers and run the malicious code. Of course, this doesn't really scale up, right? This is expensive to do, and you can't do it to many companies. And because of this, ransomware, even though it existed, didn't really become prevalent for quite a while until about the mid 2000s when we enter what I call the internet era. So by the internet era, of course, now you have most companies are now connected to the internet, and everybody is using email, right? Email is now uh, very widely spread, and so this has now makes the ransomware criminal's job much easier in the infection step. So instead of having to mail, floppy disks, the ransomware around this time just send phishing emails, right? And the hope is that somebody will respond and gives them a way into the victim's system. Um, Additionally, we now have standards for encryption tools, right? So we can now the ransomware around this time start using strong standard encryption schemes, encryption systems that are available, on the internet today. And particularly, switch from using sort of secret key encryption to using public key encryption, which allows them to encrypt your computer without ever having the decryption key actually be on that computer. So there's no way for forensics team to somehow recover that secret key by looking at your hard drive. But there's still a challenge in this internet era, which is how do these companies get the ransom, right? How do they pay the ransom to the criminals? The problem, of course, is that the criminals don't want to identify themselves, and they really want some way of doing anonymous payment. And so the next big breakthrough for ransomware came around 2009 was the introduction of Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is a decentralized cryptocurrency that allows pseudonymous payments. And the ransomware criminals quickly realized that this was their gold mine. This was their way of enabling companies to pay them without having to tell them who they are or setting up some sort of anonymous bank account that the companies had to pay through. And so this really sort of led to the modernization of ransomware. Was the first one, sort of CryptoLocker being one of the first ransomwares that demanded their payments in Bitcoin, and now almost all of them do. And of course, also by this point, our ransomware sort of have matured a little bit and now use strong standardized public key encryption. Um, Additionally, the next step that ransomware took around this time was that they started not only encrypting data, but also stealing some sensitive data in order to use that for blackmail. So not only will they encrypt your data, but they'll also say, "Hey, we have this, very sensitive data of yours. If you don't want us to reveal it publicly, pay the ransom." And so this also started around this time. And this really sort of led to the, propagation of ransomware. Ransomware started getting more and more common. There started being more and more attacks. And eventually, this led to what I call the ransomware as a service era. But the idea was that these ransomware companies realized they don't have to do the whole attack end to end. They can just provide the tools that they have built up, the encryption and the ransom tools, as tools to any criminal who now wants to run a ransomware attack. So the idea is maybe I am a criminal. I happen to know, the login information or have some access to some particular network. But I don't have the sophistication to run a full ransomware attack. I don't know how to do the encryption. I don't know how to set up ransom payments. There are now ransomware as a service providers that will give me all of that. So I will contract with them. I will give them my access information. They will do everything else. They will collect the ransom. They will then take some small percentage of that and give me back, you know, the bulk of the money. And so we can think of this as a truly democratization of ransomware, right? You now don't need expertise. You don't need the skills to be able to build a full ransomware attack. Instead, these ransomware as a service providers have really enabled sort of kind of these worldwide ransomware attacks. And we start seeing that very recently. So, for example, WannaCry was really the first worldwide attack with 200,000 computers across 150 countries that were encrypted. And really, these things start to scale up, right? Moreover, it allows ransomware to start to specialize. So, for example, the Ryuk ransomware only attacks some specific victims, and so they can say that, hey, we will only encrypt, victims in the financial industry, maybe, and because again, now there's it's really sort of become a business, and this has become a major direction. So now that we understand the history of ransomware, let's look at how ransomware is played in the medical industry specifically. And unfortunately, healthcare has been a target for ransomware since the very beginning. In fact, that AIDS ransomware I mentioned earlier from 1989 was actually distributed at the World Health Organization's AIDS conference. So it was already targeting medical applications. But most recently, we've really seen a huge growth in attacks on the medical industry. So, for example, in 2019 to 2020, the Ryuk ransomware attacked hospitals across the U.S. and in Europe as well, and it shut down access to patient records, doctor devices, and really interrupted treatments. The Conti ransomware, for example, attacked Ireland's public health system and actually disrupted services at multiple local hospitals and actually completely shut down the network of this public health system. And even very recently, there's a ransomware that calls itself Corona ransomware that specifically targets hospital, and they kind of pretend to be COVID-related information to get, social engineering to get onto the victims' networks and then encrypt patient records. So the question is, well, why are hospitals, why are healthcare such big targets? And there's a couple of reasons. So first of all, hospitals are generally large. They have lots of different employees, most of whom are not really cybersecurity experts. And moreover, as ransomware attackers know that hospitals hold very sensitive, very important data, right? It is clear that the hospital needs to have the patient records, right? If they don't have access to patient records, they can't operate. And they will pay money to get access back to those patient records. And because of that, a lot of these, ransomware attackers have sort of really targeted healthcare as a valuable target. And this is so much so that the FBI and CISA and DHS have warned that there's an increased and imminent wave of ransomware cyber attacks that compromise patient care and expose personal information. And you don't have to look very far to see examples of this. So actually, if you look, I believe this was from a couple of weeks ago, um, look at the map of COVID cases in the U.S., you would see the following. And this doesn't mean that Maryland's somehow doing amazingly well and have no COVID cases. What it actually means is that the Maryland system for reporting COVID cases, uh, for counting the number of cases, was actually hit by a ransomware attack. And so for a period for, I believe, over a month, Maryland was actually unable to report COVID cases to these tracking systems, which is of course terrible for public health because obviously public health decisions and so on are based on these type of statistics. So fortunately, while the number of attacks on healthcare have grown, there has been some public backlash against this. So, for example, as I mentioned previously, the Conti attack on the Irish health system actually drew so much backlash that in the end, Conti said, fine, you can have your decryption keys for free, and didn't actually collect the ransom. But still, the disruption of that time during which things were encrypted cost the hospital system at least $20 million. Otherwise, these ransomware as a service providers, such as DarkSide, will explicitly say that we will not attack medical organizations such as hospitals, again, because they don't want to fall up for that. So now that we sort of understand that the ransomware is still a major problem in the medical industry and kind of where we stand, let's quickly look at some possible defenses. So the first defenses really are kind of defenses that are standard against any malware. And remember that ransomware is just malware. So the first line of defense is train your users. Train them not to click on unknown links. Don't install unknown software. Beware of phishing emails. And user training really stops the adversary's easiest way. And it won't prevent all attacks, but it'll prevent the easiest attacks. So the next thing we need to do is we need to try to detect ransomware. And there's lots and lots of work on detecting ransomware based on their IDs of malicious programs, based on addresses of command and control centers. There's behavior-based detection where you kind of look at standard ransomware behavior. There's machine learning-based detection. And the nice thing is that because ransomware often gives you months between the original infection and the actual attack, you have time to try to detect these things before things, can't be recovered. And in fact, most antivirus tools today actually look for ransomware and have tools for detecting ransomware. So, as a moral of that, just keep your antivirus definitions and your systems up to date. Keep yourself as secure as you can be. And finally, of course, the big thing is backups. Make sure you have your critical data backed up to enable recovery in case your data is encrypted. Now, it's important that these backups need to be off network because, of course, if they're on the network, the attacker will just find them and encrypt them as well. And make sure they're usable, right? So actually test your recovery procedures. Make sure that you can recover from your backups. And in fact, there have been many companies that have chosen to pay the ransom even though they have backups because they never tested, what is the cost or how long would it take to recover from their backups. And finally, going beyond what a single company can do, there have been a number of U.S. government actions against, particularly large-scale ransomware. So, for example, relatively recently, you know, the U.S. government arrested one of the founders of the R-Evil ransomware gang. Once he was in Poland, and they've seized lots of money from this gang and so on. Similarly, while we don't know who did this, it believes that the U.S. government was involved in shutting down one of the major ransomware as a service players called DarkSide after the Colonial Pipeline attack. So, government is not going to go after everybody, but they might thwart the biggest players. And in particular, because of this, we really should work together. Companies and government need to work together to stop this ransomware menace. And in particular, there's guidance from the FBI that says that if you've been attacked, one of the first things you should do is contact your local FBI field office, file a report with their Internet Crime Complaint Center, make sure they're aware, and then they can help you deal with the attack. So most of the material in this talk was drawn from one of these references, including images, and thank you very much.